Hello and a warm welcome to all of you on Sarva Gunn Sampann. I'm your host, Anu. Thank you for joining me on yet another podcast where we spotlight and celebrate the unique identities, personalities, perspectives of women of India, Indian origin, and the diaspora so that we can learn from one another, understand, appreciate their journeys, and gain invaluable insights. If you like the content of this channel, please do subscribe. Thank you once again for joining me. My guest today is a woman who values the right of everyone to be free. She values the importance of rational thought and empathy and a commitment to personal growth. Her strengths include resilience, the ability to give and receive love, and the capacity to learn. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shoba Avadhani to this episode of Sarva Gunn Sampann. Shobha, I'm very pleased to have you. Thank you so much for joining. And how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thank you so much for having me. I think it's a brilliant idea, and I welcome it as a chance to connect with you, to connect with the other people in the sort of network and community that you're building through this venture. But yeah, I'm doing fine. Everything's okay. I'm glad to say no huge ups and downs at the moment. No news is good news.
Yeah, let's try to hold on to that and keep it that way for as long as we can, right?
Yes.
But thank you so much once again for obliging me and being my guest today. We have 5 segments to this show. Our first segment is about your childhood. It's called Bachpan Ke Din. And here, I'd love to take you back in time to understand what life was like when you were a kid. All the influences, the environment, and the times you spent as a kid. So, Bachpan Ke Din for you, Shobha. Please take it away.
Okay, well, where do I start? I think on the whole, it was an interesting childhood. I was born and brought up here in Singapore. So it's a diasporic existence. It's always been a sort of hybrid kind of identity, a hybrid sort of setting that I and my sisters have inhabited. And so there was a kind of, I would say, a very distinct 2 spaces, right? Or 3 spaces. Let me draw my childhood out in terms of 3 spaces, right? One space, of course, is the home. And here, my parents worked very hard to try to maintain the culture, to try to follow all the usual rituals and ethos and so on, which wasn't easy to do with 5 children. Then the second space was school. And in school, I think it was complex because it was so different from home. I had a lot of teachers who spoke English in a particular way, and it took me a while to grasp what they were saying. Friends who were mostly, Singaporean Chinese. Singapore is almost 80% ethnic Chinese. And so the culture shock was quite a lot between these 2 spaces. But the third space, I think, was a kind of cultural space. And the third space was dance. So from the age of 4, my mother put me in Bharatanatyam classes. And after a few years, I took up Kuchipudi. So that was a third space where, there was a sort of sense of community. You grew up with other Indian children, right? Some are diasporic like you, but some are not, So everywhere, I think all these 3 spaces, there must be more spaces, but I can't remember them. But everywhere in these 3 spaces, there were these little clashes that would take place, these little conflicts of identity. And I think that while those conflicts did create some trauma, they also made me who I am today. And one of the things I'm very interested in is that kind of diasporic experience, especially, of course, in the South Asian context, which is the one that we inhabit. So yeah, lots of happy memories, lots of difficult ones as well. Having 3 sisters and a brother, that was an amazing experience. We did have our fights, we did have our difficult moments. But on the whole, my happiest memories as a child were of all of us together. My mother looking relaxed, because the dinner was over, all the dishes had been done. My father looking relaxed as well, wearing his dhoti and his white kurta, after coming home from work. And all of us just sitting around chatting about our day. I really worshipped my mother and my 2 older sisters. Like, I really looked up to them a lot. So everybody being present that was my happy place.
I love the way you separated this into 3 aspects, talking about home, talking about school, and talking about your social circles, right? What was the most, when you talk about the conflicts, as you were trying to adjust to your environment, especially school, what was something that stands out now when you look back as a hard thing to process for you at such a young age? What was the hardest mind of a child?
We are zooming in on all the difficult questions. The hardest thing for me to process. Let me see. This is not a question I can immediately jump into. I think, one of the hardest things for me to process was when it came to school, for example, right? I mean, there was a lot of racism. And I felt it keenly, In fact, if I can just grab something, 1 minute. So there's this book that I published an essay in. Okay. It's called What We Inherit, Growing Up Indian, in the Singaporean context. And if you look at this picture over here, the picture is actually from something that I mentioned in my essay, which is that there was one point when I was involved. I was 7 years old, and I was involved in some performance in school. And the teacher took me aside into the bathroom, and she kept trying to scrub at my knees. We were wearing some short dresses. So I suppose all the Chinese girls must have had these monochromatic legs, and then mine probably had some variations of pigment, But so she kept trying to scrub it. So then I asked her, like, what are you doing? Why are you scrubbing? She said, because it's dirty. So I told her, I remember at 7 years old telling her, it's not dirty. That's just the color of my knees, So there were lots of instances like this, which I think did shape my approach, and perhaps made me feel less of a sense of belonging, But while I felt that way in school, and I used to really want to keep running home, every time I got home from school, they'll be like, oh my God, okay, I can pull off all the armor. But home also required some performances, Home required certain performances of, I suppose, religious observance, of a particular sort of version of femininity, the sorts of rituals and regulations of sexuality and gender that are so much a part of our families. And that always felt a little difficult for me to handle. We had my grandmother living with us, and every day we had to sit for 2 hours after school and learn Telugu from her. And while I'm grateful to her for it, because of her, I can speak some Telugu, even though it's not great. I think that kind of element of coercion did not sit comfortably with me. I can't speak for all my sisters, of course, but I mean, this is how it felt for me. So I'm just picking out a few things, of course, here and there. So I think if I were to say, I do think the most difficult kinds of conflicts that arose for me had to do with my identity, whether it was my whether it was the race, or the sexuality, gender. I think these things created some amount of conflict.
Yeah. And, I'm so happy that you talk about these things, which the first instinct is to just brush under the rug because it's not comfortable to talk about, especially, when you're empathetic, you're worried about how the people in your very close circles will react to whatever you're talking about. But you're absolutely right. We do experience coercion from all around. And it's labeled social conditioning or family conditioning, and the idea is that you just go with the flow, you just accept it, and don't talk about it because it's uncomfortable. But again, from the value that you have of everybody's right to be free, it talks directly to that freedom. What do you mean by freedom? It's not just dressing up however you want or being a certain way. It comes down to the core of your existence, and that's what I think societies and people, cultures, all are trying to condition. So I'm grateful to you for speaking out on that.
If I can just add, right? I mean, I do want to add at this point, I do believe everybody is just doing the best that they can. My parents were doing the best that they could. My grandmother was doing the best that she could. Even the kids in school, the teachers were doing the best that they could within what they knew. That doesn't make it okay, of course, So I think for me, the whole idea of freedom, it starts with a small child being able to say, I don't want this. And having that no being taken seriously. So I just wanted to add that. So sorry for
sorry, absolutely. And that's a point well taken. You're absolutely right. There's never a bad intention, and we should not assume one on the part of our families or anybody that truly cares about us. I think they have themselves been conditioned. I use the word condition very openly because down the ages, we're just following what has been the norm, right? So I completely understand. And again, the positive intent is there, but again, the way it affects, like you said, a small child, who just wants to say no because he or she or they do not, it doesn't agree with them, with who they are, their reality. That has to be respected. Right. And that's something as parents we need to learn. That's the hardest thing to do. Because
I think it's very hard. And I think things change along the way, right? As society changes. Because as parents, we always feel that there are certain hills that we are willing to die on. But the hills keep shifting. So at the time when my parents were bringing us up, right, one of the hills that they were willing to die on was that they were not going to be accused of having gone to this godforsaken country and neglected their children in terms of being brought up correctly, right, according to the proper form. And it came down to something as simple as you're not allowed to cut your hair, let's say, And I remember having this conversation over and over and over again with my parents. I really want to cut my hair. The hair felt like such a burden. Even now, like every time my hair grows past, like starts touching my collar, it's like I need to run and get it cut, But the thing is, it felt like such a burden, and I could never get a logical explanation from my parents. It was just, okay, this is how a Hindu girl is supposed to look. I'm like, okay, but that's not how I want to look. So what I'm trying to say is at that point, that was important for them. They couldn't imagine anything more than that. They couldn't imagine anything worse than a Hindu girl cutting her hair, I don't know, not getting married. I don't know, But like I said, the hills shift. You look at the sorts of mental health problems that a lot of young people have today. The hill is very different now. You want to cut your hair, cut your hair. You want to shave your head bald, shave your head bald. but please tell me if there's something that's bothering you. Don't go and take some kind of extreme action because of it. So I think as society changes, those hills, those lines that we think, no, this line cannot be crossed, it does keep changing with each generation. Absolutely.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that. All right, we'll move on from here. If there's anything else you want to talk about your childhood, please do. Otherwise, let's move on to our next segment, which is Ye Kahan Aa Gaye Hum. And this is where we talk about your onward journey. So you finished your schooling in Singapore. And, feel free to talk about your high school years if you want to hear. Your career choices, what were you thinking, in terms of moving ahead? And then in Ye Kahan Aa Gaye Hum, it's basically your adult life, everything from college to, ensued after that.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you. That's actually quite a long period. I'm 53 years old this year. That's a lot of time. And I feel like I've gone through at least, say, maybe 3 different phases, So if you think about the time that, I entered university, and I mean, of course, I did have a marriage in between, which lasted for about 25 years. And I think that was one particular phase when I was trying very hard to do the right thing and be the right kind of person. And, but it turned out to be very difficult. There's a paper written by a South Asian scholar in the US, a communication scholar. And she writes about how in Hindu families, the discourse around religion is used very often to normalize a kind of domestic abuse for women, right? So that we look at, frankly, quite abnormal situations and find a way to rationalize them. So she talks about how, the kind of whole thing about Rama and Sita and so on is used to kind of whip women into shape and, keep them from complaining about their situations. And when I came across material like that, later on, once I started my further studies, I found that it really explained quite a lot of things. So I think that I got married when I just turned 21. And I think it was really too young. Honestly, I didn't know what was happening. I was a mess and I was an idiot, And I think it sort of threw my family, my parents especially, into a kind of disarray, but everybody sort of tried to rise to the occasion. And I know I'm speaking in a kind of code, but the thing is we don't have a lot of time, so I don't want to treat this like a trauma dumping session. But the key thing here, right, is that there was this period of, I think it was a struggle because I was really trying to comply and to conform. So I used to do this Varalakshmi Puja every year, and I used to really try to out Hindu all the Hindu women kind of thing. You're putting on a sort of outfit that doesn't fit you, but you're trying to comply, you're trying to fit in. But I think that after a while that just becomes too hard, And at one point, I decided that I couldn't do it anymore. And it took me a few years of therapy, actually, to kind of come to terms with the fact that, number one, I'm not a religious person. Number two, I'm not a straight person. And number three, I have things I need to say. I have a certain way that I want to live my life, and it's not this, So I think that whole phase of really trying to be hyper compliant, and I mean, it didn't work. Only I thought I was being hyper compliant. I'm sure everyone else looked at me and thought this girl is not doing the right thing and in the right way anyway. But I must say, one of the happiest things to come out of that time, of course, was my children. And motherhood motherhood gave me a sense of purpose. It gave me, it kind of showed me that I had the capacity to love. I don't think I had ever loved as much as when I had my children. And even now, the two of them are really like, they are like the like these twin stars, for me. So that was one phase. And I think that 25 years is not one phase. 25 years is a couple of phases. But anyway, I started coming out of it. I actually went into further studies, and I got my PhD in 2016. So for a long time, I was actually at home raising my children, looking after the home and so on. In 2016, I got my PhD, and then that next phase started, right? It was a phase of discovering who I am. It was a phase of trying to find my voice. And I want to say, as I did that, it was also a phase where I developed a commitment to help other people find their voice. So I teach in the university here, and I think that one of my deepest passions and my goal, right, is that nobody should go through without some kind of support and help what I went through. And I don't believe that anything so terrible happened to me. We all have a story. Everybody has things that happened to them, choices they made, and so on. But what I'm trying to say is, I think the biggest thing was not being able to speak what was really in my heart and in my mind. To be able to put words together to articulate an idea that belongs to you, that emerges from you, and is not just a parroting of what other people are saying. That kind of critical, independent thinking, So I do that in my classrooms. I do that with my students. We have individual conferencing sessions. And so much of it is about, okay, tell me what you bring here. What is it you want to say? Because I remember sitting in one professor's office and crying, not because of anything deeply emotional. I cried because there was a chance to write a paper about a topic that I was deeply interested in. And I was so deeply interested that I was scared to write the paper, because my deep interest meant that I had to come up with my own words and my own ideas. It's not just some normal thing that I'm parroting what everyone else is saying. So I've had that experience with students where they are so passionate and they so badly want, something connects to them so deeply. And they're like, I don't know how to say it because it matters so much to me. That's my sweet spot. That's where I love to go in. And I love to help. And I love to see what comes out at the end of it. So I don't even remember the phases. Yes, where I am now. That's where I am now. Freedom is something that I believe in, and the right to express what is inside you. See, the thing that I tell my students and that I have learned for myself is that we can say what we want to say. There are consequences for everything, right? But if we are always so scared of the consequences, we will never be able to say anything at all, And I think part of the thing is to balance those things and to be intentional, okay? So it shouldn't be fear that stops me, but a kind of rational thinking. So this is where I am now. And it's in many ways very different. I think I've always been quite liberal in my thinking, but getting out of the marriage, doing the PhD, being able to work, earn money, and have that agency over my life, that has made a huge difference for my ability to express myself and to help other people express themselves.
I absolutely love, your approach. It takes a lot of courage to break out of those shackles that bind you, that hold you back, where, you just want to be. You just want to be who you are. And then to take that courage to the next level and, try to educate yourself, and then help other people is phenomenal. And not to mention that it's a very liberating, thing to happen to you, all because you just decided that you want to speak out, you want to find your voice, and you don't want to hold it in anymore.
It wasn't an easy journey, and I did make a lot of poor choices along the way as well. So I think part of the thing is also to say that to live a life without making any mistakes at all is to not really live. We make mistakes, we learn from them. And one of the things I've learned, I think at one point I really hit rock bottom. And one of the things I learned was empathy. And I don't think I had enough of it before, because I was so busy trying to become this shell that I thought everybody wanted, But hitting a kind of rock bottom taught me to feel for other people, to hold space for other people. And to not judge so quickly and harshly.
Yeah, which is the hardest, I guess, part of that journey, right? Because no matter what we do, we're always judged. And then a point comes when, we just stop caring, because who is not judged? Who doesn't make mistakes and who is not judged? Everybody is judged one way, shape, or form. And empathy is understanding that, understanding how it feels when, you're just marginalized or sidelined, right? Very thought-provoking. Thank you so much for expressing your views on that subject, and all those lived experiences and opportunities, I guess, for you to really grow and evolve through those. All right. We'll move on to our next segment here, which is Kaam Ki Baat. And Kaam Ki Baat is about your work. What is it that you do? And you said you've got a PhD, so you've got very specialized education in your field, and you obviously teach. So talk to me all about that, and then we'll delve into some aspects of your work and have some questions for that. So,
okay. So my PhD is in communications and new media, and I take a critical approach, which means that my approach towards analyzing the kind of intersection, right, of technology and society is not to say, okay, how wonderful that we have all this technology. What are all the things we can do with it? Nor is it to say, oh my God, technology is terrible, we're all going to hell in a handbasket. But to say that, okay, what are the actual impacts, And in the process, of course, you look back and you see that there's nothing entirely new in the world in terms of the social impacts, right? The sorts of inequalities that new media creates, old media also had the capacity to, But also, there are a lot of fantastic media theories and a lot of work going on in sort of highlighting and foregrounding some of the sorts of new / newly old kind of phenomena, that happen when society and technology intersect. So I teach a couple of modules in my department. One of the modules that I teach is called Digital Media Cultures. Now, this one basically looks at this idea of digital transformation, right? And we look at the rhetoric of digital transformation, the discourse of it, but also the materiality of it, right? Because there is a transformation. We cannot say that there isn't. Many things have changed. But we try to bring together some theories, that can help us to kind of understand these changes at a more conceptual level, So it takes us beyond the moralizing of good or bad, right? And takes us into that kind of unpacking of these phenomena, because we can't find solutions until we are willing to confront what are the issues, So that is one course. Another course that I teach is called Sex in the Media. And this one looks at gender, sexuality, sex, through the lens of film, even social media platforms, anything related to the media. And it's quite interesting because, again, we encounter different sorts of theories that can help people to think about gender in media spaces differently, you know. One of the things I love about that class is how students will often come away from one or two of the sessions like telling me, I've had students tell me I feel dizzy. And to me, that kind of, it's like a physiological sort of reaction, right? It's a positive thing, right? It means there is some deep change that is happening. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm trying to say that they must look at it in a particular way, right? But to just say, all right, here is a particular theoretical perspective. So we look at a lot of feminist work. We look at a lot of work by queer scholars. And there's a lot in those bodies of work where people have really, unpacked, right, how gender and sex are constructed in society. So those things are very, very exciting. I actually also teach a public speaking course. I've been teaching that for a number of semesters now. And that also is quite interesting. I feel that that's one of the places where I really get to work directly with students on giving them the kinds of frameworks that will help them to articulate their ideas. And I actually find with that one, I call a lot on my dance training, because the American kind of style of teaching public speaking, of course, American rhetoric is a whole field in itself, right? But we all come from different cultures. We have our own resources. And public speaking in India, public speaking in Singapore, public speaking in China, it's different. It's not exactly the same as the American style. So one of the things that I'm quite interested in is kind of drawing on those cultural sorts of roots, and bringing them into that public speaking space. So this is some of the stuff that I do in my classes. In terms of research, I have a couple of projects going on now, but a lot of them have to do with pedagogy. I'm very interested in the theories of teaching and learning, So in particular, I'm very keen on looking into feminist pedagogy and how that can be applied, across different kinds of scenarios, and what are the sorts of new things that we can understand about the possibilities of the classroom and beyond. I've also done, some consultancy work. Last year, I went to Budapest. I was asked to go there and conduct a course on digital diplomacy for a diplomatic association in Hungary. So there's a broad kind of spectrum of stuff that I do, but by and large, it's tied together through the digital and through this critical kind of perspective on media.
Thank you so much for sharing the kind of work you do, because, for my audience, which is very diverse and, from different backgrounds, to understand some of the things you're doing, it may not be possible unless they have an interest in that and they're researching on their own. But I think there are some aspects of the digital media culture which are very evident, right? Especially in our generation, folks that have used the old media, and now all the interactions happen online and all the communication takes place in a digital world. And we're seeing how it's impacting the culture and our society. And really, we're at the cross section where now we have AI that's thrown into the mix. Mm-hmm. So what do you think is the future for folks that are looking at this field? What are some things that will not change, no matter which age we are in terms of media and communication? And what are some things that your students come to you and, they are concerned about? I don't know if that question makes sense to you, but...
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll take the first question first, right? What are some of the things that won't change? I mean, we can actually look at... Okay, so I want to say I'm very hesitant about making predictions per se, right? I mean, there are so many examples of people making predictions and then failing terribly, and then everything is preserved in digital archives now. You can't even say, oh, I didn't say that, because the internet remembers everything. But I will say that if you just take a look at what we have come through, right? We have seen repeated cycles of certain things with each wave of sort of radical, so-called radical technology, right? We have seen that the pattern is, right, that when it comes in, it's heralded by a very strong discourse of transformation. This will change everything. But we also see that some things don't change. For example, the fact that there is inequality, right? The sorts of technological development we see more and more is very much tied in with capitalism, right? I mean, the whole thing about the market and, things like that, the profit motive, right? So as long as that is what is guiding it, I think it sort of runs counter, right, to the kind of ethos that looks for, say, more social equity. It's not impossible. People still keep trying to work on it. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think the forces are quite strong, and they become stronger and stronger because now you have governments and tech corporations, for example, that have very close connections, right? And it's becoming closer and closer. And when that forms, it's very hard for citizens to be able to speak back against that. But the other thing that you have seen repeated across various cycles is that you do have people who try to fight back in some way or another. And so those negotiations around technology, I think, is something that may take new forms sometimes, but it's not going to go away. Mm-hmm. And I think when it comes to things like AI, we are also seeing a kind of thing where there is a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of discourse generated around it. And how do I put it? In a sense, a lot of institutions have been changing in anticipation of this kind of new technology, right? So what do I mean by that? I give you the example of education, right? Higher education. What we call the technologization of education, right? Of course, it didn't start with AI, right? There's work that goes all the way back to the 1960s that looks at how technologization comes in the first place when you have standardized kinds of curriculum. And then people have to keep producing all this documentation. People have to keep quantifying the learning, right? So that lays the ground, right? Mm-hmm. And then the next step is like, okay, let's say computers come into the picture, all right? So then computers in the classroom. Then the next step is where you have all these platforms and you have all these learning management systems. And then the next step is when AI comes in. So then when AI comes in, it looks as though, oh, yes, you see, I mean, we can really fit this in. There are amazing things we can do. But the thing is that the ground has been laid for quite a long time. So what I'm trying to say is that because of this, I think there is a constraint in terms of how radically we can use AI in something like education. Because the ground has been prepared for certain directions of uses. Does this mean nothing radical can ever happen? Obviously not. It's just you see the patterns and you can kind of draw some conclusions from those patterns. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense to you.
No, it does. It does. I think from a perspective of, an everyday, a common person, when I talk about something's not changing, I'm talking about the need to communicate. Like, for example, that's one thing that no matter how evolved your technology is, we're always doing things in response to the social needs. And so communication is going to be one aspect that will will be altered definitely by machines that can do a better job, a faster job of whatever humans can do. But then again, coming from a space of consciousness, I think how people communicate, the need for communication, and to do things in a way that impacts us as a society is something that may not go away. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you are right. And I mean, even if you look at, say, all the kinds of ways in which people predict that the jobs are going to change, right? That the workforce is going to change. Some things are not going to go away, right? You look at healthcare, for example. However much, okay, patient records, diagnosis, whatever, right? But at this point, a lot of countries, especially, we talk about the sort of global north countries, and, they have shortages in terms of nurses, for example, right? So there are professions where the need for that human touch is very important, right? At least for now. But these are also some of the most poorly paid professions, and the point is that it doesn't have to be this way, So if we look at some of the things that maybe are not going to change, right? We talk about communication. We can break that down further, right? We have a lot of people who are working in this area of communication for social change, right? Communication for good, for example. And, so sometimes it's really about, okay, how do you sort of gather people? How do you influence people in order to be able to come together and push for the kind of change that they want to see? So one of the things about social media, right, is that and this connects to the second question that you asked, what are the things that, my students come to me concerned about, right? In their writing, some of the stuff they talk about is, that kind of isolation and fragmentation that social media can create. But at the same time, they also acknowledge that it can also create community. It can also create spaces for intimacy, especially for people who don't have those spaces offline, So another thing that they are concerned, especially if you look at the women, right, the young women, I've had students write essays about experiences, right, of having, say, intimate photographs shared without permission, without consent. And this is, you can see, right? It's a real fear. This is not something that's a moral panic or something. This is women's lives, So this is another thing that I think they worry about, right? Is I feel like there's a bit of a lack of control, a lack of agency, right, over some of these sorts of digital outputs and the content that they put out there. Larger questions pertain to things like the future, right? Work. Singapore has a declining birth rate, right? Increasingly, people don't want to have children, And I don't know. I mean, to my mind, people not wanting to have children, right, is an indicator of a lack of faith in the future. I mean, that's one way to look at it. Of course, there are other ways to look at it, right? Which is perhaps that individuals on an individual level having a child is not a rational decision. There are more reasons not to have a child than to have a child, So yeah, I mean, that's just one possibility. But these are some of the things that they talk about. For the most part, their lives, their friendships, their work. They worry about whether they can get work, because the thing is that they are communication students. They are, in fact, very well placed, to enter some of these sorts of digitally oriented industries. But at the same time, the competition is huge, So fair enough. I mean, I think it is very valid fears that they have.
Yeah. As somebody who teaches, what kind of specific skills are you working on to address those concerns, even if talking about outcomes for your students?
Well, I think that in a lot of the courses that I teach, right, a lot of the outcomes have to do with that kind of critical awareness, the critical perception, right, to be able to sort of understand things at a conceptual level rather than at always just an instrumental base level. And I think that that level of understanding is helpful, right, when it comes to making sense of complex phenomena when they go out into the workplace. Also, of course, skills related to writing, skills related to speaking, we don't directly teach media production, but the students do engage in some of it. And I think a lot of the skills relate to these sorts of soft skills, the ability to, I think, show up, in an intentional way in a complex, globalized kind of world, right? To move out of that sort of parochial way of thinking that, okay, everything is just about, I don't know, my apartment, my coffee shop where I go and get my lunch, but to have that sense of global connectivity, and to have that sense that the things that they do they don't do in isolation, that the consequences are not isolated consequences, that there are systematic ways of approaching these kinds of complex or what we call wicked problems, right? And that one of the key skills is being able to actually draw on different perspectives and weigh these perspectives, So I think this is some of the stuff that in my classes I teach. But of course, I work in a department that is quite diverse, So while my courses that I teach lie very much within the sort of media and cultural studies sort of field, we also have people who teach about things like UI, UX, design and research related to user interfaces, user experiences. We have people who teach about, communication management, things like PR, crisis communication, and so on. So there's quite a diverse sort of range. So students come in and they choose what they would like to do based on that.
Yeah, it sounds so fascinating. And I'm just, wow, I missed that bus, where I could have enrolled for a course like that. It sounds so interesting. And it's so broad. This field is so broad, from...
It is broad, but you didn't miss the bus, okay? I'm sure you're much younger than I am. I got my PhD when I was 46.
That is very inspirational. That's great to know that there is hope and we can do something about it. But, it's fascinating just listening to you. I can actually see myself in a classroom like that, soaking all of that, great information in. All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing, aspects of what you do. Very helpful. Lots to think about there. And so we'll move on to our next segment from here. And this is your X Factor. So this is your personality.
Okay.
What do you think is very unique about your personality?
I hesitate to say unique because I think that has a comparative element and I don't do well with comparing with other people. But I will talk about what I think I have discovered is sort of, maybe central to my personality. And I think one of the things is connection. I really believe that whatever we achieve, we don't achieve on our own. At every stage in my life, I have had people who helped me and people who cared. And all they asked in return was that I pay it forward. I mean, all the way from my sisters, when I left my marriage, I mean, each one helped in whichever way that they were able to. And my brother as well, poor thing, he keeps getting left out. My siblings, I should say. And then, when I wanted to study, when I wanted to step into work, there's always, or I haven't done anything alone. Nothing has been alone. Who I am is an amalgam of all my relationships, the successful ones, as well as the ones that had to end, and I believe that I'm connected to other people as well and have been part of their journey. So I think that is something that is very central to me. It is the reason why I do what I do, and connecting and believing in that connection really drives a lot of my work as well. It is what gives me hope, and it is what I think it is what gives me a bit of courage. Another thing that I think is that kind of rational thinking. I'm not saying rational thinking in that kind of very, that textbook kind of way, but I mean in terms of figuring things out, rather than just saying, so and so said this, therefore it is true. That part of me that really struggled, I have let go of that. I can't, I just can't. It's why, for example, I don't know, I can't really connect with, say, organized religion, let's say, right? Because I can't do this thing where somebody says do something and I do it. There needs to be a space for a why. There needs to be a satisfying answer. So I think this is the other thing, And I have slowly learned to also believe in emotions. I think I repressed them so hard for so many decades. And now I really try to pay attention to them and give them a lot of space. So it may feel funny, right, to put emotions and rational thinking next to each other, but I've come to realize that emotions are quite rational. They're not separate. I think that it works together. So I can't elaborate on that from an academic perspective. It's still something that I'm thinking about. But I think these are the things that perhaps form the basis of my personality.
Love that. Thank you so much for really bringing your authentic self and allowing all of us to see and appreciate that we need to be vulnerable to the extent that we pay attention to our emotions. Because I may be wrong, but I feel like it takes up so much of our space. Also, that it has the capacity to influence our rational thinking. And anytime I feel emotional, I feel I'm so far away from rational thinking.
Actually, that's a very interesting point. So one thing, when I say I've learned, right, anything related to emotions and all that, it's like it's all credit to therapy. But basically that, you see, when you feel an emotion, right, acting on that emotion is not rational, right? But the emotion is information. Like something is, and I feel it in my body, right? When I'm anxious, there's a kind of a feeling almost like heartburn, around my solar plexus, when I'm feeling forced to do something and resentful, my legs start to hurt sometimes, so I feel that in my body very deeply. And it's just that, so I can't, the point is not to act on that. Of course, if I act on that emotion, then that rational process is not going through. But the emotion is real. It is it is data, So then it's like part of it is thinking, okay, what is this telling me? If it's anxiety, what am I anxious about? So I might be feeling anxious. It's entirely true that there may be nothing actually in the situation, right, that requires me to run away from it. But it could be that the anxiety is because something about the situation is reminding me of something from the past, right? So then my rational thinking will lead me to say, all right, I think I can go through with this thing, right? So I'm still practicing it. I'm not great at it, but I think the biggest thing is to give myself permission to take a moment, to take a step back, and to say, okay, you know what? I need a little bit of time to figure out how I want to respond to this. Before, it would be like, somebody says something, I'm like, yeah, okay, whatever, But now I have to like, okay, no, how am I feeling about this? I'm still trying. I don't think I'm great at it, but it
No,
is.
I love that. I appreciate that. Because you're talking essentially about not reacting and responding with the information that you're receiving from that particular emotion that you're feeling at that time.
Yes.
We had a
Yes.
guest, Shravanti Valampati, who came on the show and talked about labeling her emotions correctly. And I thought that was very useful because in your case, stepping back and reading that emotion correctly is the first step. And I think when she says label your emotion correctly, if you're angry, you're angry. If you're upset, you're upset. I think that is wonderful.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist by training, but like many people, I think in the current digital age, it's given us access to so many wonderful resources, and there's really some great work that has helped to open my eyes a lot. But I'm very wary also of over intellectualizing. I tend to do that. So I really try to sit with the feeling for as long as I can.
Yeah. My biggest concern has been that, the polarization that has happened. Great things have come out of social media. I think everybody's generally become a lot smarter and a lot more informed. But the quality of connections, the quality of relationships is also kind of taken a hit at some level. And then you also have communities that are, siloed, echo chambers, and all of that. You're aware of all the negative aspects.
Yes.
But again, to each his own, or to each their own, right? You want to find a community, you want to find a space that you feel good, in, by all means. But I think that there also comes a problem with that, where what kind of narratives are,
Yes. And of course, part of the thing is because online, we are often interacting with people whom we might never come across offline. Yeah. So, one of the things that we have to be prepared to do is to kind of be open to different ways of speaking, different ideas, But of course, we don't have to lose ourselves in the process. But as with any community space, right, is first of all, it takes a certain kind of skill. You notice that people who communicate in a certain way sometimes can be more successful in some of these online spaces than others, right? Knowing the lingo, knowing that kind of the repartee, for example, in certain situations. People who are willing to share certain things about themselves without fear, right, tend to have maybe deeper, quicker connections, but at what cost, right? People who are very nervous or too cagey and careful, hold themselves back, end up maybe not being able to make some of the connections that they want to make. But you're right. I don't think there is one statement that we can make about social media communications. The only statement we can make is that it is hugely diverse and dependent on many, many things. The answer is always, it depends. you know.
Very interesting. I'm just so intrigued. The more I listen to you, the more I'm just so intrigued and curious and interested in really learning more about this field. So thank you so much. I absolutely appreciate that. Okay, so we're moving into the last segment of our show. This is your self-care. What do you do daily to take care of yourself at a mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual level? What do you do?
So I want to say I'm still trying to get to the point where I can do something daily. Okay. But what I do is at least, say, 4 times a week, I go for a walk outside. I'm trying to make that every day, but sometimes it doesn't work, like if I haven't slept well in the night or something. I also have a weekly therapy. I think that has helped a great deal. My connections with other people, I meet up with friends. I have a partner who has, she has her own place. We don't live together, but she comes over and spends the weekend here. And I really look forward to that weekend. She really, how do I say? To me, she represents the kind of outcome, the fruits of all my labors to be free, So I think connection, loving relationships, joyful movement. And of course, food is something that, I'm not a great cook. I think I'm a competent cook, but I spent so many years having it imposed upon me as my task and my responsibility because I happen to be the woman, that now I have a very strong reaction against cooking. So if I'm on my own, I tend to just eat things like, I don't know, like an avocado on sourdough bread or something like that, But I read so much, outside of my work, I read a lot. And I don't judge myself for what I read. Sometimes it's nonsense, chick lit, romance kind of novels, So if someone asks me, oh, you like to read, have you read this latest bestseller? I'm like, no, I don't like to read anything that makes me have to think too much because I have to do that for work,
Yeah.
So I think by and large, yeah, I would say if I put it at the top of it is the therapy, the connection with myself. And then next is connections with other people, So yeah, I think this is what I can't say that I have, like, I don't meditate, I don't pray, I don't journal, I don't do any of the usual things. But I will say I do spend at least a few minutes every day just either sitting or standing and feeling myself fill my body and feeling so grateful that I have the freedom to do what I want to do with my life. I haven't figured out what to do with all that freedom, but I have it.
And how many of us actually go through our entire lives not figuring that most important part and not being ourselves? And I think that's the key to all the mental health challenges that everyone deals with. Nobody wants to talk about it. Everybody's comfortable talking about physical ailments and physical problems, but nobody wants to talk about the more rampant epidemic that
I do think, though, that our children's generation is very different from us.
Absolutely. Agree with that.
Largely thanks to social media. They have the willingness, the openness, the vulnerability, and the vocabulary for talking about mental health. The question is, do they have access to the help that they need? Quite often, good therapy is expensive. So this is but now also the thing is, when they are very young, I always think, I mean, of course, it's not my place to give other people advice, because I made my own mistakes as a parent. If my children were here, they'll be very happy to tell you. But one of the things I think, right, is the moment you see your child having some kind of issue, you should go for therapy. I mean, not you, you know what I mean? I'm saying when one sees one's child having an issue, I think that is what, if I could have, that is what I would have done differently.
Oh, that is so profound, because the problems that we see in others, they are pointing to something that is in us not right. So I think you're right about that. When we think that somebody else has a problem, the best thing to do is stop, pause.
Yes.
Within.
And what I'm saying is, especially when it's our children, right? Because our children are products of us, So something, whatever it is, if it's a kind of thing where you're constantly in a battle with them, the tendency is to say, oh my God, he's such a problem. I don't know why he's like this. Oh. But actually, you won't be able to do anything until you figure out your part.
All these little blockers, right? The way we have been conditioned, and how we think at them through that lens, and everything becomes a problem. So this is interesting. We could go on. I could go on talking to you.
I know.
It's so wonderful, Shoba. Thank you so much. Before we wrap up, any parting words for our audience from you?
If I were to think of parting shots, right, I would say that I think everybody is doing the best that they can. Every single person is doing the best that they can. We all have different material resources. We have different emotional and physical resources. We are constrained by various kinds of limiting beliefs and our material realities. But given within all those constraints, we're doing the best that we can. And I think that if we can accept that, then when somebody comes to us, right, like a child, one of our children comes to us and says, I need more from you, then we are less likely to see that, or I needed more from you, you didn't do X for me, let's say. We are less likely to see that as shame that we must deflect, right? And perhaps more likely to say, I'm so sorry, let's talk about it, So I think that if we can do that, I think, because I work with young people, and I have, not so young anymore, children of my own, I'm very keenly aware that one of the key things, skills to develop in today's world, if we want to guide our children well, is the ability to listen. And to listen without judging, and to listen without feeling shame, and to listen being prepared to take some accountability for how we feel when we hear what they have to say. So I want to say, for example, if someone's child comes to them and comes out to them and says, I'm gay, let's say, right? To be able to respond, your child will remember that for the rest of their life. How you responded, your child will remember, right? If your response is, how could you say that? Oh, they'll remember that. You might be able to heal that eventually, but it'll take a lot of work, right? So I feel that one of the things that we should, and it's not just our children, it can be our friends, it can be anybody. Connection is so important, but we can't connect if we are not open to who people really are. So yeah, that's my that's my parting shot. We have to be there for each other.
Absolutely. I think, you've hit the nail on the head. It starts with your children. I think that's your training ground, right?
I think so. Yeah, really, I think you're right.
They can teach us so much about ourselves and, in the truest sense, what love, acceptance, and non-judgmental, behavior is.
Indirectly, though, because the children judge a lot.
Yes, they get it from us, right? Apple doesn't fall off of the
tree. That's true.
All right. Well said. I loved every minute of connecting with you, Shobha. Thank you so much for coming on this show and sharing whatever you could, whatever you wanted to talk about. And I really appreciate that. I'm sure a lot of my audience who are listening to this are appreciating and feeling grateful for you being you and coming out here and sharing all of this information.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for, making it feel safe for me to be vulnerable and to show up for myself. I appreciate that very much.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. You too, Anu. Take care.
All right. Take care.
Bye.